please take roll call.
Certainly. Committee Member Arias,
Present.
Vice Chair Maxwell,
Present.
and Chair Esparza.
Present. Good afternoon to folks. I called this special meeting of the Finance and Audit Committee. We have just a couple items on the agenda today. It is the approval of the minutes from the last Finance and Audit Committee meeting held last February, and then discussing and considering direction concerning city audits. Generally speaking, as we do have audit items or item on the council agenda tomorrow. I do want to thank my colleagues here for stepping up on very short notice and coming together. What I'm looking to accomplish here is I'm looking for very clear direction from this committee to provide to the council at large tomorrow as we navigate a discussion about city audits. There have been questions over the last several weeks with regards to the level of transparency around city finances and some proposed solutions. I think today is a good opportunity to flesh out some of these questions as we dive into the larger conversation at tomorrow's full city council meeting. This is an opportunity, I think, to flesh this out and restore some public confidence. I feel that this Finance and Audit Committee has been compelled to meet because of the conversations that primarily occurred last week because of the political nature of that conversation and the need to get this conversation about audits back on track. A suggested audit of certain council members or political rivals over just a certain period of time that they have been in office is blatantly political, wrong, and unscientific. So it couldn't be more obvious what's going on there, and I think I want this committee to take a more objective look at sort of the needs. It's clear that waste and abuse doesn't just come in the form of credit card transactions. I want to take a look a bit at the bigger picture, and I wanted to hear from my colleagues as well on some of their thoughts, concerns, and ideas as we move forward to the conversation tomorrow amongst the larger council. So I do want to provide an opportunity to my colleagues as well to chime in and hear your thoughts on these matters.
Yeah, may I say a few words, Council President?
Yes, sir. You were punched up. Sorry about that. Please.
All right, well, first of all, thank you, Council President, for calling this much-needed meeting to order. First of all, I have to say that I agree with the public that this city is facing a serious transparency issue, as is evident by the headlines surrounding this building over the past few weeks. A big challenge facing City Hall right now is going to be restoring the public's trust, and we can do that by taking appropriate steps towards making City Hall finances more transparent, not just now, but going forward as well. We could do a better job at that. There are many steps our city can take to increase that transparency, but what I do not agree with is a politically motivated audit led by a single council member that only focuses on the expenses of 4 city council members he disagrees with politically. I'm not opposed to an audit whatsoever, but let's take the politics out of it. I'm in favor of an independent audit of our entire city's finances and efficiency, including credit card usage, staff time, and how money is moved around our department budgets after the council has approved annual budget for each city department, including elected officials. I also have some very serious concerns about the validity of an audit that is paid for unilaterally by one council member, or the effectiveness of an audit that costs less than $50,000. If we're going to do this right, which I do want to do, it's going to require a more expansive approach that will necessitate the audit coming before the entire council for an appropriation. If we're truly committed to restoring the public's trust, we need to focus not just on the finances of one political party, but the finances of our entire city. I was extremely concerned last week when I heard Councilmember Bredefeld calling for layoff of City of Fresno employees, and I could say that I am not prepared to make those layoffs per Councilmember Bredefeld's recommendation. As council leadership, I'm prepared to work with my colleagues and Council President Esparza to begin rebuilding the public's trust, putting aside this political witch hunt, increasing transparency at City Hall, uniting our city, and commissioning an independent audit to review the finances and efficiency of our entire city. I do have some questions for city staff and some recommendations, but I'll go ahead and let my other colleague have a chance to have some opening remarks. Thank you, Council President.
Sounds good. Councilmember Arias, before we begin our questions, wanted to give you an opportunity to chime in.
Thank you, Council President. I made it a point not to respond to Councilmember Chicken Little's every claim over the last few days, because some of us actually have actual work to do, and some of us spent actual city time on committees going through extensive documentation and meetings and understanding exactly the purpose of audits are. So I'm going to keep my comments limited at this point. I do want to give you a heads up, City Controller. I am going to be asking you about how audits are conducted. I know that you guys do a really good job of doing citywide risk assessments, and that drives, what you audit and how you audit, so that they're not politicized, but they actually help improve efficiencies and accountability in a public entity. And I'm also going to ask you about the status of some of the audits that you guys have initiated. It's been now a few years since those audits were complete. I know there's still some work to do in some of the departments. And also kind of where we're at with auditing the priorities of the 22 risk assessment, and also some of our federal funds, which I know if we misuse those federal funds, we got to pay them back. So that's been a top priority for you also. I want to provide you some level of relief, city staff. This isn't in any way meant to attack city staff. I recognize how much work 2 auditors do for a system of 4,000 employees and billions of dollars. I recognize the purpose of an audit, which is a cycle of improvement, not to be used for political points to be scored, or to in any way undermine the professionalism of our city staff. So I hope today we'll be able to provide the public an update on how we do audits, why we do them, what all audits have been done, what's the status of those audits, and also help the council craft the scope of a more comprehensive audit that isn't driven by politics, but by accounting standards, which is our fiscal and legal responsibility as a governing body. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Arias and Council Vice President Maxwell. I did agree with a lot of what I heard from each of you. I think we do need to go in the direction of, again, audit that is independent of the city, but the scope, I think, of which, again, we'd like the input of the city controller and, of course, this committee. So, Controller, we'd like to invite you up, and I did want to provide an opportunity to the city manager if you had any just general thoughts. I know in a regular city council meeting, we'd kind of have the open kind of air, but I want to provide you the opportunity if you wanted to chime in before we begin asking the controller questions.
Absolutely. And just so I understand the process, this is before the approval of the agenda, to confirm?
That is on the agenda, yeah. So first thing on the agenda, approval of the agenda.
Yes.
You have not taken that vote.
Do you want to do that before I talk, or, okay?
Thank you, yeah.
Motion to approve the agenda.
Yep, I will second, and I do believe we have actually an amendment to that's actually the amendment, so we'll approve the agenda. Any opposition to approval of the agenda? Okay. Motion to approve the minutes. City Manager, you had an minor amendment that we wanted to read into the record.
Absolutely. Under the minutes presentation ID 21-286, it talks about the presentation of the CAFR. The above item was presented to the committee by Finance Department Director Lima, Assistant Director White. If you could just change that to Assistant City Manager White. Yes.
Clerk, do we have that?
Yeah, we've got that noted now.
Okay.
We will make that update.
Just an error in the minutes.
So I'll make a motion to approve the minutes with that amendment.
Second.
All right. Any opposition? Seeing none, the minutes are passed. Thank you for the reminder, City Manager. We were eager to get right into the
I know.
meat and potatoes of this meeting.
I just wanted to make sure I wasn't stepping over your process. So thank you so much, Council President.
Sure.
agreed that there have been a lot of discussions about, I think Councilmember Maxwell said, serious transparency issues. And unfortunately, it has been very frustrating for the administration because I know in addition to things being addressed to the council members, there have been attacks is too strong of a word, but accusations made against Mayor Dyer, alleging that he hasn't been transparent on items, which have been inaccurate and unfair. So we absolutely support transparency and encourage transparency. So we've been very frustrated by being accused of having a lack of transparency. And I wanted to make sure that's very clear because it's just wrong. On the issues that have to do with city finances and spending and the issues as of late regarding the credit card transactions, I'm very happy to hear the questions and dialogue that's going to go be discussed today regarding an audit. I hear, obviously, I'm just hearing this for the first time, so I'm reacting to what I hear you're talking about as far as more of a like citywide, very comprehensive type of audit. And so I'd be very interested to hear that discussion. As you may know, the mayor and I are very interested as well in the more recent issue at hand because of the discussions that and the allegations that Councilmember Bredefeld has raised with regard to specific issues. And so we are very interested in also moving forward with having a very clear understanding of what did and didn't happen, were policies followed, were policies not followed. We have not gone through the issues that Councilmember Bredefeld did, and so we feel it would be good to have a third party looking at all of those transparent, all of those records and confirming whether or not they complied with existing city policy today. So we do plan to move forward with that. That's a little bit of a smaller scope than what I think I just heard you all talking about. So I'll be very interested to hear what your discussions are today. So thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thank you, City Manager.
And City Manager, if I may too, I also want to, I've been asked a lot to respond to some of the claims that were made about credit card use, but I want to be clear for the record that it wasn't until yesterday that the city provided all the documents that were provided to Member Bredefeld and made public. So I literally just got to review the documents last night. No fault of city staff. You guys are busy, as you should be working. But I have not reviewed any of the other documents that were published from other offices or from the administration completely. So I just want to be clear to the public, it's not that we're not attempting to respond, it's that it's an ongoing cycle of somebody throws something on the wall, they want you to respond, they want to play gotcha, but they don't provide you the basic documents that people are asking you questions about. So I want to recognize the city staff for, you all have a lot of work to do, and setting up for council meetings and dealing with the federal rescue funds and whatnot. And I don't appreciate your staff being weaponized and your time being wasted when people selectively disclose very, very small pieces of information without being completely transparent with the individuals who claims are being made about or the city in general. So thank you, City Manager, for the information yesterday, and I will review it. I'm not sure I'll spend a whole lot of time. I think that's work for the auditors to do versus us looking at it from our individual perspectives, but thank you.
Councilmember, I do want to apologize. You were the first person last week that asked for the information. I sent it to every other council member last week, but you. I don't know how that happened. That was on me. So I know you know I didn't do it on purpose, but when you said, well, where is that? I was like, I sent it to you, and I didn't. So it is accurate. I just did send it to you, but I did send it to the other council members last week.
City Manager, for me, it's a recognition that we've been in space together since then, since a week ago. I've been in space with the mayor, but we're actually doing work and doing other things that are far more important than, some, distraction of the day. So there's no fault of staff. I actually am glad that you guys are focused on day-to-day operations of the city.
Okay, great. Well, I think I'm hearing the same thing from each of my colleagues, from the administration. I think we're heading in the direction of an audit. Controller, thank you for joining us at this meeting today. I know it's short notice for everybody involved, but I appreciate everyone being here. I think we want to just kind of lay down some sort of basic tenets here for the benefit of the public. You know, in terms of audits, and we do have the option to do an external audit versus utilizing the 2 auditors that we have in-house. That is correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Do you have any sort of idea what range of costs we might be looking at? Whether it's this sort of politically motivated scope for council members for the last 3 years, or whether it's sort of a larger type scope where we're looking at every employee who might have a credit card or reimbursements, or even larger scope where we're looking at all different sort of, you know, waste and inefficiencies across the board. I mean, any kind of, what's the range? I don't expect specifics, but is it go from 60,000 to 6 million? Is it a few hundred thousand? I mean, what are we looking at?
Okay. Well, good afternoon, committee. Mike Lima, Finance Director, Controller. Yeah, it all depends on the scope. You hit the nail right on the head. If the more years, the bigger the cost. The more people you look at, the bigger the cost. I can tell you that for our financial statement audit that we do each year, the price has been about $160,000. But if you're going to go into more depth, into a really deep dive into an issue, you're probably looking at that kind of amount, if not a little higher. So I would say 6 figures is a reasonable estimate.
Controller, how many city credit cards are currently in existence?
79.
79.
Okay. And going back to your question about, or to your comment about sort of the scope, can you repeat the last part you had mentioned?
You mean about the more years you do, the more it's going to cost. The more people you look at, the more the cost. You do more years and more people, it's even more cost. You know?
Got it.
That's the bigger you cast the net, the more it's going to cost.
In terms of process, you said about 160,000 for what we pay for annually.
For the financial statements audit, yes.
Yeah. So is that sort of a thorough combing through of everything, or is there sort of a scientific method of selection? Because I mean, I think what we had heard last week, right, in the conversation around the media and such, was sort of a very thorough combing through of sort of transaction by transaction. Is that what is it? Is that kind of service included in the 160, or is it more? Is there a method to it?
No, the 160 does not do that kind of level of audit. Or actually, what you're talking about would actually be called a agreed upon procedures, is what it would be called, where you go specifically into a certain category or certain account and you look at that. Financial statement audit is the broad overlook of the entire city and all the different funds that are there. That would be an audit in our parlance, is how we would term that. But to get to your point, I think it would again, it would all come back to what you define as what you want to look at.
So, City Controller, if we're to define it for the last 10 years, every single city credit card, including not just the transaction, but the backup material to ensure that it was within guidelines, would that be in the $50,000 range?
Oh no, it'd be much higher than that. Much, much higher. You're talking at least 6 figures, and I would say probably in the $300,000 to $400,000 range for something that big. Okay. Every card for 10 years would be pretty expensive.
And if we went to, because we currently have your credit card, then you have your reimbursement, right? Or expenditures. Would that include, if we included reimbursements and expenditures, would that expand the scope?
Yes, it would make it even more expensive. If you're looking, believe what you're referring to is we have the credit card, and then if you do like a travel or you do some sort of other expense, you turn in a separate form for that. Yeah, if you're reviewing both, it will be a lot more expensive.
So in our current system, if I go to Las Vegas for quote unquote conference, I have to turn in, I pay for it, I submit a reimbursement, looking at whether I attended the conference, whether that conference was appropriate use of city funds, it wasn't going to the concerts, whether the meals were appropriate, wasn't spending it in the go-go dancers. That kind of review would be far more expensive than simply your annual financial audit, right?
That is correct. I believe it would be, yes.
And I think what we're discussing here too is, I mean, some of the discussion last week didn't just include credit card purchases. It really was a conversation about all expenses, right? Even the memos and check requests that we've gone through in your office. So if we were to include that, I suspect it would become even more expensive, just sort of looking at all expenditures generally out of any particular office.
Yes, again, like I've said, the bigger the scope, the more more expensive it is. So if you are now not just looking at items that were charged on the credit cards by council members, but you're looking at everything that they've spent, that is a much more expensive audit at that point.
Controller, if how would you evaluate if I gave the police chaplaincy $5,000 for the run-a-thon? How would you, as a controller auditor, evaluate whether that was appropriate use of city funds?
We would come back and ask you if what is the city business purpose of that? That's what we would ask you. And if you give us a reason why you felt that was city business, then we would go ahead and authorize that payment at that point.
Got it. But you wouldn't go beyond to audit the police chaplaincy program on how they use the resources, would you?
No, but the police chaplaincy because it's a city-associated nonprofit, they do provide financial statements to us each year. So we do have the check as to, I wouldn't be able to tell you that $5,000 was spent on this item, but I would know they got $5,000 from you and they spent it on these items
So
here.
let's shift to like the Marjorie Mason Center, not a city-affiliated organization.
Mm-hmm.
We provide $1,000 for their annual fundraiser.
Mm-hmm.
You simply asked the question, was it a city purpose?
Yes,
Yes, therefore it's appropriate within the guidelines of expenditures, correct?
that's correct.
To go beyond that and confirm whether those $1,000 went to the CEO for salary and benefits versus paying utilities of the facility, that's not within your normal scope of audit, correct?
Exactly, that is correct.
And if we wanted to go down that path, that would be substantially much more expensive.
Much, much more expensive. Yes.
Thank you.
Controller, how long have you been in this position as the controller of the city of Fresno?
7.5 years.
7.5 years. So you had said 79 current credit cards issued.
That is correct.
I believe if I had to estimate, 12 of which are the council level, 6 members, chief of staff and member each, so 12. Do we know how that 79 has fluctuated throughout the years? The last maybe you can't speak to the last 10 years, but maybe the last 7.5 years. Has there been an increase or decrease in the number of issued credit cards?
Oh, there's been a substantial increase over the last few years as people are buying more on the internet. You buy things through there. They don't want purchase orders and checks. They want credit card payments. A lot of hotels, when you're booking travel and and conference registration, a lot of them want credit cards and not checks. And so I guess the financial environment is moving more and more to a credit card-based environment. And so it is something that we are seeing more, and as a result, we've issued more cards over the last few years to address that.
But is that correct? I want to make sure I heard that correctly. About 12 to 14 cards for the council out of the 79 you said?
That would
citywide?
be
Okay.
about right, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
City Controller, as you indicated, the market has shifted. If I have a conference at the League of Cities to go vote on protecting our tax revenue model for the distribution centers, and they ask for a credit card, our option would be pay for it out of my personal credit card, seek reimbursement,
Yes.
which means that I probably eat up the interest that was earned, right? Because that's
Yeah.
probably not reimbursable.
You would lose that, yes.
Yep. So, or hope that the hotel is going to take a purchase order from the city at some point, right?
Or take a check wait for a check, in essence. Yes, that's correct.
Correct. Or you guys cut a check in advance.
We've done that as well, yes.
So who authorizes any department or director that wants a credit card for whatever reason? Who ultimately authorizes who gets a credit card?
That would ultimately be my shop. We ultimately authorize those. What typically happens is a department director sends a memo and says, I would like to have a card issued for this individual in the amount of, they ask for what the credit limit is. We do some follow-up and say, well, what is it going to be for? But a lot of times they put that in the memo, and then we go ahead and process the credit card application at that point.
Thank you.
So there has been substantial increases, as you noted. I mean, has that been the last 3 years? Has that been the last 5 years? Has it been the last?
I would say the last 5 years, we've had quite an increase. We've probably gone, I would say, from maybe 50 to the 79 in the last few years. So, yeah, we've picked up probably, they've increased by about a third, I would say.
Okay. That is quite a bit in the last 5 years or so, roughly.
Yeah.
Okay. And can you attribute that to any department in particular? Has that been city council? Has that been citywide? Has it been
There has
planning?
been some with council, definitely. Fire is another one who's added quite a few in the last few years. But I would say those are the two big ones that have had the increases would be council and fire.
When I first came on council, it was sort of this sort of automatic protocol, and I appreciated it because even when I just begun, we were getting our feet wet and getting in the groove of things and how things work. And so maybe at first I didn't realize how much a credit card would be needed, but we quickly discovered, right? It was a very useful tool in serving our constituents. So that was automatic when I came in. How long? Do you have any idea how long that has been the case, where it's just sort of automatic protocol for council offices, council member and chief of staff to be offered and receive a credit card?
That's been a relatively recent benefit. I would say probably 5 years ago that started. Shortly after the Brand administration took office, that became kind of the policy. But before then, there was none.
There were none.
There were none for council members.
Oh, wow.
I believe even the chiefs of staff didn't have them at that time. Everything was run with vouchers.
So it was not incremental. It wasn't sort of like, one or two offices had asked for them and then eventually became a sort of council-wide policy. It went sort of zero council cards to now it's sort of standard issue.
My recollection is one council office did request it at the time, and the decision was made if one got it, then all needed to get it. And so, or at least be offered it at that point. And so most council districts took advantage of that offer.
Okay, so I think we have a rough timeline of roughly 5 years back. You said at the beginning of the Brand administration?
Yeah, right.
So we're like, about shortly over 5 years
about
ago.
5 years.
So if we were to go back 5 years, do you have any sort of guesstimation of what kind of cost it would be to take a look 5 years back, credit cards, reimbursements, and just council expenditures, generally speaking, any kind of ballpark figure, what we might be looking at for an external audit?
I would say it's somewhere between $100,000 and $250,000 is what you're looking at. It's six figures. It's going to be.
That's not bad. I for some reason in my mind I had it at seven figures. So this is
No, it's not going to be that much.
this is a bargain. And cities should be willing to pay a pretty penny for this level of transparency. Okay, yeah, that clears quite a bit up. Just gives us context. And the reason I ask these questions is if we were to conduct the audit as proposed by one council member last week, right, just focused on these four folks and for these last 3 years, right? I think all of us sort of see that for what it is. But I think there'd be no real comparative analysis of whether this has been standard practice. Is this sort of how it's always been done? Is this a pattern? I'd be looking for context, right? And so as far back as council offices have been issued credit cards, I think that's probably about, at minimum, the appropriate scope. But even before cards, doesn't mean that there weren't these types of expenditures. It just means that it had to run through sort of purchase order or a check and, have a sort of maybe a second set of eyes on it before it went out. So 5 years, credit cards, possibly another 5 years. I think you had suggested 10 years, Councilmember Arias, if I had heard you. That might be its own sort of secondary kind of analysis. And if there was a difference in types of expenditures from when there were credit cards versus when there were not credit cards, And if that made any difference in levels of spending and types of spending, I think that's something I'd be very interested in terms of context and comparative analysis of what this current council, how their individual offices spend those dollars.
Council President, I have some questions on audits.
Please.
Controller, I'm familiar because I serve on the audit committee, but can you explain for the public what a risk assessment is and how that drives your determination on what departments to audit?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So a risk assessment is a review of each department. We go in and we say, how many transactions do you have with the public? How much cash do you handle? What's your revenues? When was the last time you had internal controls looked at? And based on the answers to those questions, we make up a matrix which says these departments have the highest risk. That doesn't mean necessarily that something inappropriate is happening there. It just has the highest risk, in our estimation, of something like that occurring. And so from that risk assessment, once we rank those and score those, we then go in and we select our audits. We don't have to follow the matrix per se. If there's an area that maybe there's greater interest, our internal audit team will go there first. But in general, the risk assessment does guide what internal audit looks like, what it looks at.
So for example, your 2020 risk assessment identified public utilities and water as
Yes.
your top scorer. I'm assuming because people come in and pay cash
Right.
for their water bills and utilities, right? And there's the potential for
Yes.
things not to be accounted correctly. After that, it was transportation, facts, because people are probably paying dollars and coins as they enter the bus. Then police. I'm assuming that has to do with the fact that they tow people's cars, they
Yep.
take fees, tickets, things of that nature.
Yes.
And then public works and fire. So this process, isn't this a standard process for determining what departments and what accounts get audited?
Yes, it is. It's recommended by the Internal Auditors Association, and it's a process that's used throughout all internal audit units that are, whenever there's a government that has an internal audit, they use that process to help determine.
And if we went to a more modern day politicized, auditing process, 3-4 of us on this dais decides that Georgianne made us mad yesterday, so we're going to go and audit all of Georgianne's travel for the last 15, 20 years as a city employee, and redirect all your staff to that work. That would essentially no longer follow the national state standards for auditing, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And that would take away and redirect your staff from auditing high-risk accounts?
Yeah, it would. Not only that, it destroys the independence of the office. The whole, the ability of that unit to be effective is that they are primarily independent. They do not respond to political pressures. They objectively look, and that's why the risk assessment is so important. They objectively look where the biggest areas of risk are for the organization, and that's what they structure their audit program around.
Quick follow-up. I'm sorry, I don't have the document in front of me that Councilmember Arias does. Where did Council and Mayor's office fall on that risk assessment for this past year?
I don't recall it off the top of my head. I believe it was about in the middle of the group. Am I right?
This year,
Have we ever risen sort of above the middle? I mean, I know between council and mayor, those have always been relatively small, proportionally small budgets in the grand scheme of the city budget. The 700,000 per office figure is only very recent thing. And even then, it's still, again, the grand scheme of the city budget is very minuscule. And even when combined with the mayor's office, very minuscule. So
Councilmember.
has it ever risen above or below that middle area?
No, it's
your
never been
recollection?
one of the top ones. They have not.
and
Yeah.
the 22 assessment puts the mayor and manager's office in the bottom 1/3
Yeah.
of a prioritization.
I was going to say, good.
Yeah, so, so which by the way, all these risk assessments are online on
Yes,
your
thank
auditing
you.
webpage, so thank you for that, easily and accessible. This year's assessment shows the Parks Department looks like number 1. I'm assuming because we got an influx of Measure P funds, and there's some very clear rules on how Measure P funds need to be spent. We're not supplanting money, we're not robbing the voters of what they, dictated through the voting booths on how that money should be spent. And then, of course, Public Works, Planning and Development, and our city attorney is now in the top 1/3. So based on this risk assessment and your report, you're indicating that you're going to work on a couple of areas for this fiscal year. And I do appreciate that in your risk assessment, you also articulate the limited staff that you have, the amount of hours that are actually available to do, work, given the limits of the human capital that we have, and the scope of all these areas. So based on your action plan or work plan for this year, you're looking at transportation, grant management process, I'm assuming because we got a lot of federal money, and there was very clear federal rules on how to spend it in the facts. Wireless devices, which is new to me, and ISD. I think it's fair to say that in the world of COVID, we did a lot of equipment, a lot of wireless hotspots, and we need to make sure that those things are tracked and used appropriately. A transitional review, interesting, of the airport administration, changing leadership, finance department's accounts payable, and then parks administration again. So your 2020 risk assessment, your 22 risk assessment, it's all based on your independent review of the risk of these accounts, of the competing priorities that have taken place since then, and of new variables that we weren't expecting, like hotspots and changing leadership at the airport. So thank you for that. I just want to remind the public, this is what's important, to have an independent controller that will not respond no matter how loud I scream at you or on KMJ or on Power Talk. You're going to stick to your independent analysis, your risk assessment, and your scope of work that's in the best interest of the public and the taxpayers. I do want to shift a little to the past audits.
Councilmember Arias, can I just ask
Go
a
ahead.
quick question, just a sidestep to our city attorney's office? I have not served on this committee before. What formal authority do we have? Do we have any sort of subpoena power or anything like that on this committee?
The charter does provide the council as subpoena power. Honestly, I've never seen it used.
Okay, but it is.
It is in the charter.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So to your past audits, and again, audits are not meant to be used as political weapons. They're meant to use as a process to improve the operations of a local government or an entity. So in 2019, we did an audit of the police department, specifically around moonlighting and officers working as faculty at Fresno City College. And this is the challenge with audits, right? I'm sure every department head cringes as when your folks come in, make some findings. In this case, there's quite a bit of findings, significant findings that people were moonlighting, claiming that they were on the city dime working while teaching at the city college dime, and they were past their limited 16-hour that they could moonlight, that they didn't have work permits as required by policies and procedures. A lot of stuff that's not necessarily flattering, but important for the new leadership to identify and resolve. I read your latest update on the police audit from 2019, and it seems that we still have some work to do in the police department. Specifically, I noted that there are still multiple identified instances where officers continue to teach courses on city time. There's also instances where employees are still not fully complying with these laws associated to work permits.
That was correct.
So even after significant findings in 2019, the pandemic hits in 2020, we're in 2021, we have a new chief, 3 chiefs later, there's still progress to be made in fully addressing the audit findings, correct?
That is correct.
And for the record, no one is calling for anybody's head at the police department because there's improvements to be made. As a matter of fact, one of the most telling pages of your latest report is page 8, where you indicate that during the audit, you had approximately 156 folks working greater than 16 hours in moonlighting. Now you have about 9 individuals. That's exactly what audits are supposed to do. Identify a problem, make recommendations, have the professional staff implement changes, and see improvement over time. At no time has anybody on this body ever suggested that officers were committing crimes or engaging in fraud or any things of that nature, because clearly the audits found that there were things that were not being done within procedure. I also read your audit findings on the fire department, Your scope of the audit in the fire department was specific to overtime use.
That is correct.
And your audit found high overtime hours incurred by sworn fire department staff, incomplete shift replacement and overtime forms, untimely shift replacement and overtime form approvals, incorrect premium pays used for overtime that caused overpayments.
That is
People
correct.
got overpaid for overtime, right? Your audit doesn't use language like fraud, embezzlement, crimes are committed, and I don't think anyone has ever described, audit findings that way, correct?
That is correct.
So these recommendations have now been made to the fire chief, and I'm to assume that the fire chief is taking action to correct those audit findings, right?
I believe so, yes. You'd have to ask the fire chief specifically what steps, but yes, I believe so.
And your last audit that you did of 2019 was in the parking department.
That's correct.
I remember having to answer questions from the public on why we collect $1 billion in coffee cups of change. In that audit finding that took place in 19, you made a series of recommendations. In your updated report of this year, there's still 3 significant findings that are yet to be addressed. Bulk rate payment late fee processings were still inconsistent. New payment rates based on consumer price index increase were not applied in a timely manner. Documentation of audits of reduced citations was incomplete.
Yes.
In your view, has the parking department made significant strides to address your initial audit findings?
Yes, I would say they've made significant strides from the initial audit, definitely. But there's still work to do. Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization.
And it's not your characterization that you would, irresponsibly claim that people engage in fraud and misuse of misappropriation of funds, or that there was crimes committed when some of these audit findings concluded that not all procedures were followed to the T.
We do not make judgments on fraud or legal issues like that. We point out, here's a policy, they're following it or they're not, and that's what we make a note of. We do not make those kind of legal determinations about fraud or any kind of impropriety. Like
Now, an auditor, in your opinion, your team of, I believe, 2 auditors, is that still?
3. We have 3
now?
Yeah.
That's right, we increased one in the budget.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
That's right, you requested more money, and we agreed, given
you
all the
agreed.
federal resources that we've received that need to be audited. Remind me, I believe in one of our last COVID committee meetings a while back, you updated the committee on the fact that your internal auditors are focused on making sure millions of dollars that we're putting out in the streets from the CARES Act, American Rescue Funds, are in compliance with the federal rules that, are required with those funds, correct?
That is correct, yes. We had, what we did was we set up a system by which the departments turned in expenses they felt were eligible. We had an accountant in our office look at it, and then we had our internal audit team do a second check of all those expenses, every single one of them, and in our opinion to say, yes, they are eligible, so to help protect the city in the eventuality of an audit from the federal government.
Got it. And as we're putting millions of dollars in rental relief funds, your auditors are also reviewing to make sure that we catch any fraudulent applications and claims, correct?
I do not have the internal audit team doing that, but I have other staff doing that. So they're going through 2 checks as well on those, yes.
So
but
you
not
have
with internal audit.
checks and balances within your finance department to try and catch any bad actors?
We are trying, yes.
Got it. Okay. So I just wanted to spend some time, I've been on the audit committee for 3 years now, and I think it's fair to say I'm always pretty harsh on the audit staff, like when are we going to be done? When is staff going to respond to your audit findings, department head, city manager? When are you going to address what needs to be addressed? And some of these audit findings, no fault of the system, require significant investment from the city.
Yeah.
We needed to update software, we needed to update technology, we needed to add more staffing to different departments to meet some of these recommendations. So it is a significant tool for operating the city that I'm going to protect from any politicization, no matter how loud any Chicken Little council member screams, because your work has to remain independent, has to remain based on risk assessments and self-improvement of the city. And I would just finish my comments with this, council member, council president, that we all know we have an obligation. Every credit card expenditure that I engage in, every transaction that I purchase with city funds, I know is a public record. My calendar has been requested through public records 3 years in a row. Everybody I meet with is a public record. Every email essentially is a public record. When we get elected, essentially that election is a job interview. A re-election is a job evaluation in my view. And it's ultimately the voters who we answer to and to the rules and regulations of this city that we have to adhere to. So I want to remind folks that all of us, in my view, have done that intentionally, followed the rules. And even when the intention is to follow all the rules by city staff, there's still improvements that we identify, and that's your role as an auditor and controller, is to identify those areas of improvement, whether it's fire, overtime, police moonlighting, or parking meters, and for us to fix them without the mudslinging and accusations that only makes it that much more harder for our city manager and mayor to hire high-quality professional staff when there's a cloud over the city that, there's constant chaos, which there isn't. So I just wanted to remind folks that there's a process, it's in place, it's working. I have confidence that you guys are following it based on the risk assessment. I've seen progress in some of these findings. There's still more work to be done, and we'll be critical, but we'll also be supportive when you need city resources to address those findings. So with that, Council President, those are my questions for today.
Thank you.
Council Vice President Maxwell.
Yeah, City Controller, I just want to thank you for your time. I apologize
You're welcome.
that you sign up for a role in city government, you inevitably get drawn into the politics, but I do apologize for anyone that has been wrapped up somehow into the politics of all this. I do apologize for that, but I do thank you and your staff. I know you do diligent work. The more I'm learning about audits, this is very nuanced. These are not simple, but what I'm realizing is that this is a science. Things are followed closely. Certain things trigger certain provisions trigger audits. And if an audit comes up and says council could work better on spending on certain issues, I think everyone here is open to that. What I don't want to confuse that with is a difference of political opinion. If money should not be used on a certain thing, and that's very clear, none of us are going to have an issue doing our best to conduct to those recommendations. However, if someone disagrees with me that public safety includes buying a bicycle for a little girl to get to school safely, that's not the science that's coming from the audit. That's a personal opinion, and those two things have to be made very separate. What is adhering to the administrative orders and the recommendations from the audit versus what a council member that represents a vastly different district with different needs and political ideologies from the one I represent thinks is a good use of the money of the folks that I was elected to represent. I do appreciate your time. Quick question, when we do our annual audits, one of the ways to not use direct city resources is often behest payments and kind payments, correct? If we wanted to subvert using direct city dollars, that's an option open to folks, correct?
Yes, if I understand you correctly, yes, that would be an option.
Could request that the money go from a private individual to funding a public project.
That doesn't usually happen quite like that, where you get private money to contribute. I think I know what you're referring to, and my understanding is there's a nonprofit set up to address that, to receive those, and to supplement what the city's operation is, but it isn't like the person is giving money to the city to do it directly.
Gotcha. Do those get looked at during annual audits? Those dollars, the sources, what they're being used for?
The nonprofits have to report to us every year. I get reports every year on their expenditures. Any city-related nonprofits, so like the Police Chiefs Foundation, the chaplaincy, we talked about those. And I believe the one you're alluding to will also be doing the same thing. But we do get those reports, but beyond that, they are not included in the city's audit because they are separate legal entities by themselves.
But, for me, if our goal here is, total transparency, if we're not using city dollars to fund a public project, we're using directly or inadvertently some private dollars. I think it's worth noting, where those dollars are coming from, who's investing in those projects.
Yeah.
For the sake of transparency, that's why I ask.
Okay, yeah, between the city and what the city's contributing and what the nonprofit is contributing,
Yep.
the public should know what dollars are going into that area, absolutely.
Okay, it's clarification, but hey, I do appreciate your time. Thank you, Controller.
No problem.
City Controller, on that notion, I know our agreement with the Grizzlies allows for annual audits, but
Yes.
it's been a few years since we've audited them, or correctly?
They submitted audit reports every year up until to the 2020 year. They did not because they weren't operational, so they did not do an audit that year. But my understanding is they're finalizing one right now for the 2021 season,
Yeah.
and we should be getting that any day now.
Okay. And what about with the Visitors Bureau? I know they receive some of our motel tax directly to do Visitor Bureau work. Do we audit that agency?
No, we do not. I've never seen an audit of the Visitors Bureau.
Yeah, and I know they get a couple $1 million directly of motel tax set up to attract conventions and other things of that nature. Okay, and what about our homeless service providers? You know how we contract with Poveralo, with several nonprofit agencies to operate our shelters. Are they audited annually?
I've not seen those audits, if they've been done. If we're the pass-through for federal dollars, we do have an obligation to make sure that they're following the federal guidelines, and so we have gone out and looked at them, but in a very limited scope, of just what have you done with those federal dollars. But an overall audit of them and what did they do with, general city fund monies, I've not seen that.
Correct, and I'm assuming it's because every nonprofit has to do their own auditing
Yep.
standards to be in compliance with the IRS, so their entity does annual audits
Yes.
as required.
And the
But-
state as well.
and the
State
state.
requires it as well.
But we don't go and audit
No.
the $5 million that we gave to one agency to do web
No.
services for the year.
Again, unless it's federal money that we're passing through, we do not do that.
Got it. And is there any other, semi-city related entities that we don't audit annually?
Well, we provide money to a lot of people, a lot of agencies, and we do not audit those.
I'm thinking those more like, for example, the redevelopment agency is a, entity of the city.
Yeah.
Right? I know we go through audits, and those audits are approved by this body when we're in the redevelopment board. Is there any other such quasi-city, agencies that we're not aware of?
No, not that I can think of. No.
Thank you.
City Manager, you were punched up.
I just wanted to respond to a couple things that got brought up, just some observations. So you talked about different agencies that we contract with. So generally speaking, as the controller said, if they're a federal agency and there are grant reporting requirements that we obtain. If it's just a consultant contract that we're awarding a contract, no, we don't audit those. And that, obviously, if they're required to be a legal business entity, they're going to have their own reporting requirements. We talked about the nonprofit that Councilmember Maxwell brought up. So I think, the questions that I'm hearing and the comments that I'm hearing, and I think Council President Esparza touched on it and other council members, I think what we're seeing is a result of a philosophical shift of this body. Our policies are the same policies, the AOs that control city spending are the same AOs that have been in place for many, many years. And they are, the policies are developed with expenditures to be in line with more of the I don't know if traditional is the right way, but it's been the way that city dollars have been spent for many, many years, the definition of city business. And city business has been predominantly, business that benefits the entity, the city of Fresno as a business entity. I think what I hear is, at least from several of you, that sort of your definition may be different than that. And I don't know that that's wrong or that's right, it's just different. And our policies don't really jive with some of the things that you define as a priority for city business, whether it be the bicycle, as you described, Councilmember Maxwell. So the policies that we have now are very traditional sort of city. We're operating as a business, and this is what we need to be spending the money on to operate as a business. It's very conservative. So to the nonprofit comment, so given that that's always been, not always, but for many, many years has been the policy of the city of Fresno, you are correct. We have had, so other entities have been used to be able to fund other priorities of departments or the city that were inconsistent with those policies. So whether that be a police chief's foundation or a fire chief's foundation or a One Fresno foundation, whatever it may be, those were used as mechanisms so as to not intentionally not spend city money. So I think if, we have the policies now, I think if anything, what Councilmember Bredefeld's comments have raised is, I haven't looked at all of the issues that have been raised. I haven't looked through stacks of documents. I don't look at your budgets, at what you're spending money on. But when issues are raised, when comments are made that indicate there may be a possibility that expenditures may not be consistent with that current business conservative policy, I think it's incumbent upon, when something's brought to my attention, and whether that's you or whether that's a department in the city. I've had issues brought to me about departments, and I would do the same thing. I'd go in and I'd look at it. I think it's incumbent, and I feel like I certainly have a responsibility to have a third party determine if the policies were followed, not just for 4 council members. I would say it would apply to anybody that has a city credit card and is expending money.
And City Manager, I think we're on the same page. I think at least what I'm saying is, I agree, let's have a third party review this, but let's go beyond credit cards. Because credit cards are not the complete expenditure record for a city. And I don't want to suggest that we're that far apart philosophically on what's appropriate, right? When I looked at the mayor and city manager's expenditure reports, it includes purchase of canopies, it includes purchase of lunch, it includes, buy lunch for the UC Davis folks who are helping us create a whole new animal shelter system. All appropriate, right? There's not one expenditure that, at least I've seen, no matter how sensationalized it was, made publicly by council officers, that doesn't show up in the mayor and manager's expenditure reports. All those things, all those expenditures, in my view, are appropriate. In this case, we've been sidetracked because there's been intentional selection of only using a microscope for some, describing them as inappropriate. For example, I have an expenditure of $971 to Chef Paul's. I paid for the council lunch for the whole council. Everyone, including the member who made the claim, ate the chicken. Some of them got seconds, right? Was that inappropriate expenditure? No. You guys are here working through lunch for a 10-hour council meeting. Me and Ed's. We eat me and Ed's when we're here at 5 or 6 o'clock going to a 9 o'clock evening meeting, right? But in the public, I'm having a private catering event F Chef Paul's. That's not the complete context or accurate picture. So I'm not going to, sit here and say, well, city manager, you spent money on training somebody how to use a drone. That's not appropriate use of money. It's a priority for the mayor, for the city manager to communicate using modern technology. Do it. It's in the best interest of the city.
And it's consistent with the policy.
And it's consistent with the policy, as all these expenditures are.
Well, council member, here's the problem. I can't say that all of them are because I haven't looked at them.
Yeah.
So I know that you say that, but I can't say that today because I haven't looked at them. And there, as we know, there's, I don't know, hundreds of them at least. So I think, and the items that you described, I agree, are consistent with city policy. There are very clear policies about paying for meals for staff. The philosophical difference that I'm talking about is when it gets to paying for things for people outside of the building, I think that's where we get into the area. And I think ultimately what it means is at some point, we're probably going to have to update our policies.
Yeah.
And that's the point I was getting at earlier too,
Yeah.
City Manager. We got a bipartisan city council. We got two branches of government that usually work together, sometimes don't see eye to eye
Yeah.
on philosophy or politics.
Right.
And that's fine. What I want to make sure is, if we're going to make changes, it's going to be based off the scientific evidence and data shown in an audit, not whether a conservative believes this is fair versus what a liberal thinks is fair. That
I would
starts getting
agree.
into a divide of politics.
And what I hear you saying, though, I think will ultimately end up as a policy discussion from what is found, from what a report demonstrates how expenditures occurred. So I think ultimately where we will find ourselves is some sort of policy discussion. And I want to make sure that you guys, I understand if the council, I accept the fact that if the council wants to have a different policy, we'll implement it. If the council body wants to do something different in the future, we'll implement it. We will respect the vote of the council majority and implement a different policy. But right now, today, we have current policies. And so that's what I'm focused on is,
And city manager, the current policy today is audits are not used as weapons.
Hold on.
And
City-
audits
city-
are not based on political
City manager has the
statements.
floor, but we'll get back to you.
yeah. And when I mean policies, apologies, I mean the AOs, AO 1-4, AO 1-9. Those are the policies those are the ones I'm worried about. And I'm worried about them for 7 council members, for me, for the mayor, for department directors, for everybody. I want to make sure everybody is following the policies. So that is my priority. And if there are areas in that policy that need improvement because they're outdated, because they don't account for internet transactions, people don't accept POs anymore, then we ought to look at changing that. But right now, we have policies that we're supposed to be following. And I think it's incumbent upon, when something's brought to our attention, to look at that and make sure that the policy is being followed. And if they're not, I know I'm already doing it right now for department directors that report to me. Why would this transaction happen? What was the purpose? If this is not in policy, do not do it again. I'm doing that with the people that are under my jurisdiction because I don't want to wait. I know an audit is going to take time. I mean, we're in tax season, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Accountants are very busy right now. So we may not see the result of any audit for months. I mean, it may be past the summertime. So I don't feel like I have the luxury of waiting for that when we have policies right now that we're supposed to be implementing. So I sort of see it more along parallel tracks.
I
think
agree
we're
with
saying
that.
the same thing.
I agree with that, City Manager. If there's things we could do better, let's do it. Let's not make it political. Let's all hold ourselves accountable and make those adjustments accordingly.
I would also agree. And I think based on what you're saying is there's probably a discussion that's going to happen here in the very near future with respect to policy changes, but also maybe revisiting of those policies again for a second time after the completion of an audit that'll better inform, how we, and guide how, expenditures are made within the city.
And Council President, I do want to just send one clear message to our city employees and to the public. I'm never going to be supportive of weaponizing audits, irrespective of my difference in, what resources should be prioritized. I'm not going to be seeking audits because Georgianne, the city manager, or the mayor, disagreed with me yesterday. That's not the purpose of an audit, and we should not be weaponizing it. And that's the policy that I'm concerned with protecting, that this controller and on the audit team remain independent. They look at audits based on risk assessments. They provide honest, direct recommendations, and the department heads, implement them and ask us for resources when it's necessary to fully implement those findings. And in the meantime, we can continue to provide some training to all our city staff on the proper use of credit cards. We can make sure that people provide receipts and backup materials as the rules require, but we should not allow the weaponization and politicization of audits to take place in this city, because if we do, the moment we do, we're gonna find ourselves being audited by the federal government for misuse of federal money that we then have to pay back because we took our eye off the ball. That's actually really critical, which is $1 billion of new federal resources coming to the city. So thank you guys, and Mayor, I know we're always working on actual problem solving, so thanks for showing up today.
You bet. If I could just add to what the city manager said, the intent of us seeking outside CPA is for the very purpose of keeping it independent and objective. The scope of the review, and it won't be an audit, it's a review, as I understand it, in conversations the city managers had with the CPA. It will be independent, it will be objective, and whenever that is completed, we'll bring it forth before this body. But it is not going to be directed by our controller's office.
And Mayor, what I don't know if you caught the conversation, but I think what I've heard from my colleagues is we want to expand the scope beyond just, the credit cards of the council. We want to expand it to, maybe all credit cards, maybe for multiple years. We want to make sure that there isn't any perception that we are targeting the direct administration credit card use or the city manager White's, tenure as a city manager. Let's look at the thing in full context and look at also other things that are equally high risk.
Yeah, so I think we in the beginning of the meeting, Mayor, you weren't here. You got a busy schedule, and this was very short notice. But there were some ideas. We talked about how waste and abuse comes in different forms, not just credit card expenditures. So controller gave us a lot of context about how many credit cards are out there, how long council has had credit cards, how payments were issued beforehand. Well, what I've indicated, and I think sort of the conclusion we're starting to kind of rally around after about an hour and 15 minutes of discussion here is, we support a review, audit, whatever you want to call it, of council expenditures, both credit cards in the last 5 years, and the actual expenditures that happened via check, or what you call it, purchase order.
It would be check ultimately. Yeah.
Yeah, check or purchase. So just sort of a full review of those 5 years, and then what I want to see as well is 5 years prior to that, a comparative analysis of before when council did not have credit cards, and kind of see how the spending habits in amounts and types of spending have changed. And this is for, again, comparative analysis. So not going outside the scope of taking a look at council, mayor expenditures, credit card reimbursements, and again, everyone who has a credit card, but really just sort of honing in more closely on the type of review that we are diving into. That actually brings me to another question for you, Controller. This is probably a lot more folks than 79 who have credit cards, but how many folks would you say, do you have any idea, within the city organization, receive reimbursements or have the ability to do sort of these checks, check requests beyond like the standard purchase orders?
You mean like how many people get like travel reimbursements and stuff like that? Is that what you're referring to?
Sure, sir.
Some kind of any kind of reimbursement from the city, basically.
Essentially, right? Yes.
It would be, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I would say at least a couple of hundred people are able to get reimbursements. We send a lot of people on training. We send a lot of people out of town to keep their skills up, and yeah, they get reimbursements. So we probably handle a couple hundred at least each year.
Okay. And then, okay, so I mean, if we were to include that level, that would, again, probably increase the scope
It would
even
definitely
more.
increase the scope, yes.
Okay.
City Controller, would you describe that as like management? Is it typically management who have those arrangements?
You mean for travel and?
For travel
No, I would not,
reimbursements.
I would, yeah. No, I would not say it's only management. There are frontline staff that get that kind of training as well. One of the things that we get now, again, getting to the internet, utilizing the internet option, is that people do online classes and the city will reimburse. So you can be a frontline person watching an internet class and then get the city to reimburse you for that. So it's a mix.
Yep. Well, so I guess last question on my part, or statement/question. With respect to some of Councilmember Arias' comments about, how we conduct audits and, how we're directed, I've been chair of this committee for the last 3 years, and you've been controller during the entirety of that period. And these meetings have only ever been sort of informational, right, for the committees, information. Obviously, these are public meetings, so, not once in that time period has this committee, whether it's these members or other members, ever leaned into you and asked you to audit or try to weaponize an audit. We've never really exercised the full powers of this committee, right? Never subpoenaed anyone before. And so, I think we are of the same philosophy, right? That we got to be conducting audits in kind of the scientific manner through the risk assessments. We've seen the council, mayor's office has never been at the top. It's always, on the contrary, been at the bottom, maybe the low middle at the highest. And so it's not being done to the controller's office, but I wanted to ask you, because again, the mayor and city manager have made very clear this is sort of going to be independent of even you. But, so any council member getting on TV, throwing a tantrum, whether it be about council budgets, whether it be about police department budget, whatever budget it might be, that is not a criteria in your risk assessment for conducting an audit.
Well, we always take council or mayor, city manager input, but ultimately the risk assessment drives the audit schedule. And that is put together with rather empirical data. It is not done, as all of you have indicated, it's not done at the whims of the moment. You try to do that in an empirical way.
So this review that we're potentially conducting, in the process of conducting, this is not something that you would have otherwise taken on?
No, and frankly, given the nature of it, I would strongly recommend that an outside firm look at this.
I would not do that that's internally. A no-brainer. Yeah. That's a no. But otherwise, you wouldn't. It would not have otherwise been your recommendation. This would never come to your attention had there not been sort of a public debacle about it.
It was not on our risk assessment. It was not on our radar at the moment. So at this point, no. It may have risen to that eventually, but at this moment, no.
Sure. Okay. Well, just wanted to put that out there for the public's benefit, right? And that what we are talking about doing here, you've come, even though this review will be conducted independent of you, you've come here to help educate and inform the public. What I want the public to know is that although this certainly is would never have come up, in a scientific or sort of numerical manner, that the administration, this council, or at least this council subcommittee, if we'll see about the whole council tomorrow, are committed to, again, taking action to restore public confidence because of some of the headlines over the last several weeks. So I do want to make that clear, right, that this would normally not have been in your purview at all. As I had mentioned earlier, I mean, I suspect part of the reason we're relatively low on the risk assessment is because of how small the budgets are, in the grand scheme, proportionally compared to the city's general fund, and the city's budget at large is probably, that's more than likely why it has been kind of at the bottom.
That is correct, yeah.
The potential for abuse or waste or fraud has been probably very minimal opportunity.
That is
in
correct.
those departments.
Yes.
Okay. Mayor, do you want to chime in at all? I mean, we've kind of, I think tomorrow, this subcommittee is kind of honed in on sort of a deeper dive, not a broader dive, not a wider dive, just a deeper dive into what we are looking to find out, and have that comparative analysis that we discussed here today. I understand, based on at least the controller's just sort of estimations here, that will exceed 50,000, and we are committed to finding those dollars in order to explore that scope. Wanted to hear your thoughts.
Well, so the question is timing. I don't mind expanding the scope of the review or a deeper dive, but I want to make sure that we're able to do it in a very, very timely fashion. And we will be working with a CPA to initiate that process. But it is my hope that we can have something in place within the next 3 weeks, at least initiate that process to where they can start. I would hate to delay beyond that.
I think Mayor was going to drive that is, I'm assuming based on our RFP bidding rules, and that the scope of the audit would determine the amount, and then the amount would determine whether there has to be a formal bid, and that of course will then drive the timing of it. But I think those are all conversations that we can continue to have and try and meet in the middle to try to achieve all the things. But as we close this, Council President, I do want to recommend one more scope for the audit, and that's the mayor's selection of only wearing blue suits. I think we should be auditing why he only chooses blue.
They help his
There's
eyes.
so many other colors.
Mayor, I hear your concerns about timeliness, but again, you missed the first roughly hour of the conversation. We went moderately deep into how and why we would want sort of this deeper analysis. Again, not wider, not more expansive, just deeper. Because let's say we were to audit only 3 years. Let's say we audit all council members over the last 3 years. There's really no context, right, about how, if this has been a pattern, how long has this been going on. So again, council members have had credit cards roughly the last 5 years, roughly since the beginning of the Brand administration. I'd like to see at minimum that long, and then some level of audit of the previous 5 years where there were not credit cards, but there were still expenditures by council. Obviously, an auditor wouldn't be combing through every single line item, but I'm sure there's a scientific way to sort of do that and still conduct it in a timely manner without taking a look at all of my predecessors and their predecessors, every single line item.
So to Councilmember Arias's point, we're having initial conversations, sort of like sketching out like what a scope might look like. And you are correct, over $50,000 is going to require an RFP process, and we can certainly expedite that. And I think what I may hear is this may be sort of a phased approach, where I understand your context comment, which I think is important. And of course, what's important to me is current policy. And so for me, the first step is the current policy discussion, and I do think then it goes into the deeper dive of the comparative analysis. So perhaps we need to be talking in terms of sort of a phased approach. It is one big plan, but I do sort of think it can be organized in a way of, I want to make sure that if there are any violations of policy, that those are being fixed right away while we're looking at the broader issue and the context of the issue. So we can certainly talk
City
about
Manager,
that.
my concern there that we'll have to work through is I don't want an initial review to say, the mayor spent $1,000 on, whatever. And then we didn't get to the deeper dive till 3 months later to confirm that $1,000 for that whatever was actually appropriate. and that it was a good public use. So I don't want
That
to-
is my plan for the first part. It would
Correct.
not just be, it was $1,000. It would be, it's $1,000, it didn't violate policy, it did violate policy, or the policy is not clear on that particular expenditure.
So it wouldn't be a Butterfield audit.
That is what I'm hearing. I mean, we just had a long conversation about conducting things in as sort of objective manner as possible. And so I'd like to see it kind of all done concurrently, right? Not sort of, okay, hey, this was, what I'm hearing is you're responding to one of the tantrums that I had mentioned earlier. So again, not looking to go more expansive, but we are looking to go deeper. And I think if you were to produce a portion of that analysis without context, that does sort of raise concerns about what Councilmember Arias here just said.
I think there's a way that we can get what you're talking about in the phased approach that I'm talking about, because, we can get draft of the first part while we're doing the deeper dive that will have early insight that allows us to make internal changes very quickly. If it's identified that one of my department directors' departments is not according to policy, I'll have immediate information to go and say, hey, we're still finishing this, but stop doing that while we're doing the rest of the work. That's internal conversation. That is not a public discussion. I think that there are things that we can get that we can make internal changes immediately while the broader public, report that has context can be generated.
Let me give you an example. In the police department, they have what's called a critical incident review, and it's done after a 30-day period, and they look at policy, equipment, and training needs, and so that feedback is immediate. The reason they did that was because oftentimes the investigation was taking 6 to 9 months, a year, and it was felt if there are things that need to be addressed, training needs, policy changes, or equipment, that needs to be addressed now. The same would hold true here. It doesn't become the final document, but it is something that gives a good indication what needs to be addressed in the immediate future that we can take care of internally. And then there's going to be the final review whenever that is, 6 months out.
And Mayor, I think that we're also going to have to wrestle through some guidance from our city attorney. Say, for instance, you had an autocorrect, somebody using a credit card, Georgiana, you did internally. All that's a personnel matter, right? Because it remains there. It would never be public. If I have to correct, not buying from Chef Paul's, instead buying from Mediterranean to be in compliance, that's a public conversation, right?
I disagree.
Wouldn't it be because I'm not a city employee? I don't have personnel protection.
Well, I won't
Right.
want to, but the way I see it practically occurring is if you happen to turn in an expenditure that was not consistent with the policy, the city controller would kick it back and say, either what you've provided shows that it's not a policy. Do you have additional information? I think while that could be just like any emails between me and my employees are public records, that could be public record, but the conversation, generally those are just like informational, hey, do you have any more information on that expenditure? Can you send it to me? It happens every day in this building.
Yeah, I just don't want to be blamed for a cover-up by any one individual who says, there's all these things that went wrong, and they're covering it up, and they're trying to fix them before they go public, and the people are aware, right?
Having
That's in
been the
space that we're-
administration that was just accused of a public cover-up when we did no such thing, I can assure you, we don't want to be accused of a cover-up. It doesn't.
For the
we
record, I
clearly-
give you credit for being open and honest, but we're dealing with, a variable that if, we use a recycled bottle, it's now a misuse and a federal crime. So I want to be thoughtful about all the context of personnel matters that remain confidential, because I do want to give you the flexibility to identify the problem, fix it before we get to a more public conversation on the policy for future expenditure guidelines.
Understood.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is I know I had mentioned sort of 2 revisions of policy, but now I'm hearing potentially 3, because I think even prior to sort of initial findings, I mean, there are some policy changes we probably could make. Then there would be maybe a second review after some initial sort of findings from a review or audit. And then obviously I think the last and final findings will vastly inform kind of policy going forward altogether. So I'm hearing 3 potential stages of policy change going forward. And that's the way I see this whole thing, is really the moving forward portion and policy going forward, but also looking back and helping that to inform us as we continue to move forward as a city. Colleagues, folks have any additional comments or questions for the controller or administration?
No, again, I appreciate your time, Controller, City Attorney, City Clerk's Office, City Manager, and the Mayor for being here today. This is a pressing matter. Again, we're all open to correcting any misuse going forward, but also keeping that separate from political ideology, and doing what we were sent to office to do, which is to serve the constituents we were elected by. I appreciate the recommendations and the deeper dive that you've recommended, Council President. I concur with those, and I look forward to furthering this discussion with the administration. Thank you.
Yep, and what we'll do, just for the benefit of the administration and the public, we do have an audit item on the agenda tomorrow, so we will take this to the larger council and talk about what transpired here today in the context of that forthcoming item that is on the agenda tomorrow. That's the context in which this will be discussed, just so we can update the entire council. But I do think that we made a lot of progress here today, got a lot of questions answered thanks to our controller, provided context to the public. That'll help, I think, move the conversation along as we, again, dive into the full council meeting tomorrow. Before I adjourn the meeting, we do have to take public comment. So if there's anybody here in the chamber or on Zoom who would like to provide public comments, now would be the time. Anybody except the one council member I see in the audience per Brown Act. All right, seeing no public comments, this meeting is now adjourned. We'll see you all at council tomorrow for the larger discussion.